Welcome to Cinemophile, where we bring you the best in independent, documentary, and foreign films, and we talk to the people who made them. I'm your host, Mike Caspar, and you can find out more about the program by going to cinemophilepod.com. Combining magical realism and evocative hand-drawn animation with revelatory interviews and verité footage, Among Neighbors examines the story of a small rural town where Jews and Polish Catholics lived side by side for centuries before World War II. The film brings the Jewish response to the Holocaust to life through the last living eyewitnesses, revealing both love and betrayal as it zeroes in on one of the last living Holocaust survivors from a town and an aging eyewitness who saw Jews murdered there, not by the Nazis, by their own Polish neighbors. Credible film in so many different ways, especially illuminating a story that I had never heard in this detail, certainly, and one that will create an awful lot of conversation among people who watch it. It's called Among Neighbors, and we're joined today by the director, Yoav Potash.
Hi, thank you, Mike. Thanks for having me.
Anyone who has even a passing understanding of what happened in the Holocaust, what happened to the European Jews, will understand just how horrible and horrific it was and how the depths of human depravity were on display. But in this particular documentary film, Among Neighbors, I think you have laid out what we're in for in the title. That was not only the Germans who came in with this agenda to kill as many Jews as possible, but we uncover the latent anti-Semitism that was happening in Poland. And we see it play out in a series of betrayals, of stories of true cruelty that would have been, I assume, would have been unthinkable just a few months earlier. Let's talk about how this film came about, where you heard about this story in the first place.
Part of what you're referring to as you asked me about it is we all know that the Holocaust was perpetrated by Nazi Germany. They were the instigators of this mass murder of millions and millions of people, were 6 million Jews, and also millions of other people, Polish intellectuals, gays, gypsies, so-called gypsies, Roma people, and so on. What is less known is once the Nazis were defeated, they had surrendered, and the war was over, and the Holocaust was over, that some of the Holocaust survivors, as they sort of stumbled back to their hometowns, were threatened and even murdered by their own neighbors. And in the case of my film, Among Neighbors, is by their own Polish neighbors. And this did happen all over Poland, especially in small towns, to the point where some not insignificant number of Holocaust survivors of Jews were murdered in cold blood all across Poland. And this did also occur in some of the other Eastern European countries as well. So that revelation really struck me when I heard about it because especially when I heard about it firsthand from people who lived in the town at the center of the film, people who were alive when it happened and who were willing to talk about it, even though they themselves were Polish, and this did not shine a favorable light on the Polish people and Poland as a nation.
When I heard many years ago, I remember hearing stories about how, and it was about Poland, the stories that I was hearing about how so much of the Jewish culture, any remnants of Jewish culture had been essentially stripped from so many communities. This was the story I had heard, was that when Jews went back to Poland, the level of hostility and the erasure of their culture, the erasure of them having even been there before, was the version of the story I had heard. And watching Among Neighbors, I now have a better understanding, a deeper understanding
So Jewish and Polish culture were integrated and deeply entwined, going back hundreds and hundreds of years for centuries, beginning primarily with something called the Statute of Kalisz in the 1400s, which was a declaration that basically said Jews are welcome here because the Polish monarchy recognized, hey, Jews can bring something as merchants, as people who have relative in other countries. They can help with international trade. They can help with commerce locally. There's certain things that they can do and add some function and some dynamism to Polish society, moving it beyond a kind of purely feudal society. And that's what Jews did, and Polish culture thrived, and Jewish culture thrived in Poland. And for hundreds of years, Poland was actually the center of the Jewish universe. So it's really something that has kind of been less appreciated historically because the Holocaust wiped it out so completely. But part of what you realize if you spend enough time in Poland is it wasn't only the Holocaust that wiped it out. Of course, Nazis did a ton to obliterate Jewish life and culture from Poland. But even after all that, some of what was left was intentionally removed or destroyed or swept under the rug or just abused in a way. Like one example are the Jewish tombstones of the cemeteries, which were one of the few remnants of Jewish life that you could even lay your eyes on in Poland. And unfortunately, there's this widespread phenomenon in Poland where Polish people, especially kind of out in the country, but it happened in cities as well, where Polish people would take these tombstones and say, "Oh, you know what? I need a big piece of stone about that size. I'm just going to take this Hebrew tombstone and turn it into my doorstep, or I'm going to cut it and turn it into a grindstone so I can sharpen knives and things on it." So that's kind of symbolic, I think, of the ignorance, and I mean that really in the most neutral sense. Just people didn't know, in some cases, how wrong that would feel to a a Jewish person or a Jewish community. And I don't, and perhaps it wasn't always ignorance. I think in some cases it was willful disregard or even hate. But in some cases, it just seemed like ignorance, like when there are no Jews left in a community and when they are totally gone, and you find these strange stones with a language written on them that you don't understand, people don't really stop and think about it that much. And in a similar way, in some of these homes that Poles now live in, they have found things like in the attic, they find books with, what to them is this bizarre foreign language. And of course, these are Hebrew prayer books. In some cases, these books have been held on to and they've waited for some Jewish person to arrive and then they've given them to them. And that's probably one of the more thoughtful things that could be done. But it's a complex past, and part of the reaction among Polish people in Polish society is based in a fear that somehow Jews will come back and claim their property and want it back. And that really isn't the case. When Jews go back to Poland to trace their family roots, they're really looking for just a little bit of acknowledgement, someone who can say, "Oh, yes, I did hear that your family lived here," or, "Oh, yes, that is where the synagogue was. Let me show you the way there." There's a lot to unpack, and there's a lot of parallels, I think, between histories in Poland and in other countries, including in the United States. We have our own sort of darker sides of our history that some people are willing to confront, and some people would rather sweep it under the rug.
which is addressed in the film, and they're in one of the major points of the film made in the film is the law edict. I'm not sure exactly. It's a law.
It was a law.
It's a law that you can be prosecuted for talking about this idea, this reality, not idea, this reality that Polish people killed Jews, aside from the Nazis, aside from the Holocaust, upon their return, in many cases, to Poland. And we are seeing vestiges of those kind of laws all over the world, all this sort of misinformation, disinformation, denying history all over the world. But boy, this is such a gut punch for anyone who knows or cares about history of the 20th century and prior to that, and you get into it in the film, going back to this crazy ass conspiracy theories and drinking the blood of babies and all that crap. At least it's talked about in this film and just how insane all of these things are, but they live on somehow, some way. These things live on.
Yeah, and unfortunately, they're finding new life today on the internet and increasingly being mainstreamed with some of the leaders we have in place in this country and around the world. But I think one point I'd like to make about the film is we really zoom into one specific town and we're telling one
Yeah,
specific story, even though
yeah,
we're touching on these broader issues of anti-Semitism and what can we accept about our history and how difficult it is to confront the darker side of history. All we arrive at those conclusions by looking at one single town and primarily at two individuals from that town. And one of them is a Polish woman named Pelagia, who's an eyewitness to the murders that took place in the town 6 months after World War II was over. And at least five Jews were murdered in cold blood on a single night. And we've heard stories of others as well in this same town. And this phenomenon, as I mentioned, has happened elsewhere. And then our other sort of main character is a man named Yakov Goldstein, and he's one of the last living Holocaust survivors from this town and able to relate his entire story from his perspective as a Jew who grew up in the town, really feeling like it was a magical place and that he was welcome there, embraced there, had a huge family on both sides in this town, and could just kind of march around the town as a kid and be fed by his relatives, be welcomed by them, embraced, and was safe. And that his family interacted with their Polish neighbors in a number of ways. He talked about his uncle who played soccer with the other Polish boys. His parents ran a shop, and most of their customers were non-Jewish Polish people who they knew. So it was, you know, very symbolic of the kind of enmeshment I was talking about, where
yeah.
for hundreds of years, Jews and Poles were living side by side and interacting in this way. And of course, World War II shattered that. The invasion of the Nazis turned the whole world upside down and allowed some of the latent anti-Semitism, things like belief in this blood libel myth that maybe Jews kill Christian children, that allowed these horrible rumors and myths and fears to surface in really ugly and violent ways.
Absolutely. Want to remind our listeners we're speaking with Yoav Potash. He is the director of a documentary film called Among Neighbors, and it is going to be released.
The film arrives in theaters starting October 10th in New York City at the Quad Cinema. And then it comes to Los Angeles the following week. October 17th is when we open in LA at Lemley Theaters, the Royal, and Town Center in Encino. And I'm going to be there opening weekend in both New York and LA to meet audiences, to take questions, talk about the film. So very excited for that and talking to audiences. I think one of the things audiences comment on the most and are sort of struck by is the artistic approach of the film is one where we use animation to get you into Pelagia's story and get you into Yaakov's story in a real personal, intimate way. And style of animation is hand drawn, primarily black and white. So it works really well with the archival footage from that same period. And we have a number of points in the film where we sort of cut back and forth between archival footage and animation quite seamlessly,
Yeah.
where the two really feel like they're interacting with one another. We even include some archival imagery in the animation, primarily in the backgrounds. And we've really just gotten nothing but praise for the animation. And I credit the two um, animation teams that I worked with, which were international teams of one whole team of people animating Pelagia's story and another entirely separate team animating Yaakov's story. And that was both practical from a production point of view, so that we could get more done simultaneously, and had an artistic point to
Yeah.
it, which is that we each remember things in our own way. So why not have their memories literally drawn by different hands, each with a slightly different look, so that the moment the film cuts to Yaakov's memories, you know you're in his story.
Yeah.
And with the moment we cut to Pelagia's memories, you can tell we're in her story just by the way it's drawn, by the way it looks. And yet the styles are similar enough. They certainly feel that they are all part of the same film, part of the same story. And there's some synergy between the two stories as they move forward in parallel, in part because they're set in the same town and they're sort of building off of the same foundation.
Could not agree more with what you said because as you're watching the film, the animation is certainly a terrific way of telling the story. After a very short period of time, it just sort of blends into your brain that, it's just seamless. As you said, I couldn't say it better. It feels completely natural to the telling of the story. It doesn't take any amount of time to get used to it at all. It's beautifully done. And the people that you bring in addition to the main characters, the main people that we're talking about, Pelagia and Yakov are great voices to hear in all of this. Let's talk about the town. Let's talk about your initial foray into the town to talk to some of the people that we get to meet, including the father and son and others in the film. What was that like? Let's talk about the town that we're you focus on.
Sure, sure. And it's a mouthful of a town. It took me a while to learn how to say it because it's a lot of letters and consonants all mushed together in a way that I imagine to the Polish eye is, you don't blink at it. But for us, non-Polish speakers, the town in Polish they call it Gniewosław. In Yiddish, the Jews who lived there, they called it Gniewosław. It's the same batch of letters, though of course the Jews would actually write it in Yiddish, so it was then a different language, going right to left. But it's essentially two different ways of talking about the same place. And in
Right.
that sense, it really is. It's a tale of two cities. This Polish town with a Jewish town inside of it, almost literally inside of it, in terms of even where the Jews lived. The Jews actually lived at the center of the town around the market square because Jews were primarily the merchants, and then the outer ring of the town out into the surrounding farmlands was where all the Poles lived because the Poles were primarily farmers, and they interacted because of course the merchants needed produce and the farmers needed tools and clothing and all kinds of other things that the merchants provided, and it was symbiotic. But the identity of the town, of course, shattered with the beginning of World War II. Jews were first ghettoized and then essentially hunted down once the ghettos were liquidated. Of course, many Jews were just being sent to extermination centers, but those who found a way to flee, they were on the run. They were seeking help from those Poles who had been their neighbors. And unfortunately, very few were willing to help try to save the lives of their Jewish neighbors. And there are very understandable reasons why only a select few would help. And that is primarily because if you got caught as a Polish person helping Jewish families evade the Nazis, you could be killed too, and your family could be killed too.
Yeah.
So it isn't realistic to look back on history with this kind of expectation of any Pole who turned away a Jew was a horrible person. And I don't take that vantage point myself. I think the Poles who did help Jews are heroes. Most Poles did not help. They didn't do anything. They just maybe said no and turned a Jew away. And I think that is sadly understandable. But what is less known historically are the Poles who really chose to either aid and abet the Nazis, help find the Jews, turn them in, or extort them. Realize, this is a Jew in a helpless position, but I see he still has a little bit of money or he still has some jewelry. Let me extract that from him and then turn him into the Nazis. Those are the kinds of things that happen and that are revealed in the film. And then, of course, worst of all was this moment of the Holocaust being over, the war being over, the Nazis have surrendered, and then some Poles deciding to continue the violence against Jews to sort of finish the job that the Nazis had started. And that's really the gut punch historically, I think. And it is something that Polish society needs to recognize and deal with in an honest way. And roughly half of Polish society has wanted to have that reckoning. And then there's another half that wants to deny that those kinds of events happened and maintain this myth that Poland was a nation only of either victims or heroes and never perpetrators. And of course, that's impossible. You don't get to pick and choose your history, and no nation is perfect. So it's natural to have to look at one's own history and really confront it in all of its colors.
Amen. That is exactly what we see in the film, and it's hard, not to ask yourself questions while you're watching this film. It's just hard not to say, what would I have done if I were there? If somebody had come to my door? To your point, I don't know. I'd like to think I would do the honorable thing, bring them in, help them, do whatever. But again, the film, this is a certainly an important story to be told about history and how after 500 years of acceptance into a society, that society could turn on someone.
Yeah,
500 years.
yeah.
It's
And
not a
that's
small amount of time.
right.
And so all of those questions come up, and then along with it, the politics of today, the people who continue to try and deny and to essentially in some ways perpetuate this mythology, this damaging, dangerous, deadly mythology. All of it's here. All of it's here, and it's in our lives today. We cannot pretend like it isn't possible or it's ancient history. It's here. We are dealing with it right now.
Absolutely, absolutely. One of the, I think, obstacles that honestly I face in getting this film out is I recognize that there's a sense among audiences or film festivals. Oh, haven't there been enough films about the Holocaust? Haven't I seen enough? Haven't I suffered enough by watching them? And yet, this film really and truly does touch on a number of different aspects of it. It comes at the whole story from a different angle. It's not about what the Germans did. It's about the relationship between Poles and Jews over hundreds of years, and then how all of that suddenly shifted once the war began, and really about the intimate and personal relationships in this one town, how these two individuals experienced the dramatic change that occurred between Poles and Jews, how Yaakov, as a Jew, how he survived, and Pelagia, how she, as a Polish eyewitness, was herself traumatized by these murders, even though she was not the victim, she was not, uh, none of her relatives were victims, but she knew the people who were killed very well, well enough to really have tremendous admiration and feeling for them.
Yeah.
And it haunted her life. And you
Yeah.
see that all the way through to when we're meeting her in the film, and she's in her 80s, and these events that occurred are still very clearly casting this long shadow over her life, and she's on a mission to reconcile it somehow before she leaves this earth.
What you described in that, talking about Pelagia and Yakov, that this amazing symmetry, that their stories, and I don't want to say anything more. I
The
don't want to give anything
interplay.
away here, but yeah, but it's just the idea as a filmmaker, as a storyteller, finding the story and following the story and not knowing exactly where it was going to end up and how it was going to end up. It's a remarkable story. There's so many things about it that are truly amazing. And the fact that we're still telling these stories and they're still relevant today about the good and the bad in humanity and all the rest of it. It's just the sheer instincts that you possess as a filmmaker and a storyteller to tell the story and how it illuminates so much. I'm just, my hat's off to you. It's in that regard. But I'm just going to say it's still relevant. I'll say it better. It's still a relevant story to be told.
Thank you.
Well, again, I want to let people know they how they can basically check out the film.
Amongneighbors.com, and our social handles are just Among Neighbors. And the film opens October 10th in New York City at the Quad Cinema, October 17th in LA at Lemley Theaters. And then we plan to go all around the country, most of the time with me coming along
That's
for
great.
meeting the audiences.
That's great. Yeah, and by the way, in the last sentence, we mentioned the Royal and the Encino, and I'm sure be looking for it. It'll be at the website again at amongneighbors.com. You can find out more as the film moves forward. And I just want to thank you. Thank you so much for your work, and especially in the story, a story to be told. Thank you. Thank you for being here. We've been speaking with the director of Among Neighbors, Yoav Potash. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike.
You have been listening to Cinemaphile with Mike Kaspar, the place where you will hear from the best in independent documentary and foreign filmmakers. Please check out our previous interviews as well as upcoming interviews and special programming by going to cinemaphilepod.com. We are also available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube, searchable under Cinemaphile with Mike Kaspar. Until next time, thank you for listening.